This is the companion video to Part A, Stage 3, of the computer simulation project. So it's recommended to watch this previous video first. There's a link in the description. In this companion video, we'll focus on this graph, which as we'll see, will be an important analytical tool for the study of the simulated cultures. But first, just briefly, we saw in the previous video, how the simulated humans, the HUMs, now had these characteristics and attributes. And in particular, how they all had two sets of neurochemical processes. A fixed set, that is analogous to DNA, which is passed on to their children, with a small amount of variation. And a changing set, that constitutes their disposition, and is altered by the influence of their caregivers, teachers, friends and peers, and the culture as a whole, throughout their lifetime. And we also saw in that previous video, how the HUMs started out with a small initial population, and spread across the island, over the course of about 70 years. Replicating the buildings in each new area, as their population increased. Until they reached about 1,000 HUMs. In this companion video, we'll see how all of these new aspects of the simulation come together, with the introduction of this new graph. The simulation needs to be able to display how the neurochemical preferences of the population, as a whole, are changing from generation to generation. Not just the changes of individual HUMs, as we saw in the last video. So this new dynamic graph will show the counts of the first neurochemical preferences of the whole population, each year. That is to say, only the top color of each HUM's clothing is counted. And then the counts will be broken down into age groups. This will allow for a graphical display of the yearly development of the children, as they age, and their first neurochemical preference is affected by the influences of the culture. And as a consequence of this, we'll see how the culture as a whole gradually changes from year to year, and generation to generation, due to the changing first neurochemical preferences of the adult population. So just quickly, this is how the nature-nurture dynamic is modeled by the simulation, and what will be displayed dynamically by the graph. Newborns inherit the fixed neurochemical processes of one of their parents, with a small amount of variation, which becomes the blueprint for their changing neurochemical processes. Then, as the infant grows, it's exposed to a variety of age-related influences. First of all, we have the influences of their primary caregivers, from birth to 4 years old. These are usually their biological parents. And in a traditional culture such as this, that usually means their mother. The influence of caregivers, in general however, is somewhat unique. In that it continues on, right up to age 20, but it tapers off as a child ages, and other individuals start to have a greater influence. The next main influence on a developing child is from their primary school teachers, which is from 5 to 12 years old. And then, once a child becomes a teenager, it's their secondary school teachers, friends and peers, which have an increasing influence on them. And finally we have the influence of the culture itself, which acts to some degree on a child throughout its life, and continues acting on adults for the rest of their lives. So let's run the simulation now, and see the data updated yearly on the graph. We'll do 2 runs of the graph. The first run will be without any cultural influences acting on the children. So the inherited neurochemical processes of the newborns simply develop naturally as they age and become adults. And they then pass these characteristics onto their children, with a small amount of variation. So this is the extreme case of nature acting, without any effect of nurture. The second run will be with cultural influences acting on the children, at each stage of their lives. This is the more realistic scenario. And as we'll see, this will show how cultural influences maintain the character of a culture from generation to generation. So here we go with the first run. No influences are acting on the population for this first run. So we see initially that we have the first neurochemical processes for the starting population, represented on the graph. So only the first neurochemical preferences have been counted for this starting group. Only the top color of their clothing. Some of the starting group are aged between 16 and 20 years old, and are represented here. And as we'll see, these younger individuals will age and quickly move into the adult age group. The two most prevalent, first neurochemical preferences, of the adults, are other awareness and metaphysics, which is typical of a traditional culture. Here we go now running the graph. All the adults marry in the first year, and start having children. So as we get to year 6, we see the birth of the first generation of Humes, with its diversity. We'll show all 7 neurochemical processes, for this age group. And we also see, that all the younger members of the starting population, have now become adults. Moving on now. The infants are moving into the child age range of 5 to 12. For the child years, and for the teenage years, we'll only display the top 3 neurochemical preferences, otherwise it becomes a bit too confusing. Now the population is approaching 300, and the first generation of children is moving into the teenage years. When we get to year 25, we'll pause for a moment. We're seeing a lot of diversity among the child age groups. So we're at year 25 now, which means the first generation are becoming adults, and are moving into the culture as active members. So their first neurochemical preference is being added to the adult counts. And if we look at the child development period, we can see the diversity of the top preferences, as created by the development of only the initial inherited neurochemical processes, which develop at a constant, preset rate each year. Moving on now. So the first generation is now moving into the adult age group, and almost immediately, at year 30, we see that the culture has changed. The top 2, first neurochemical preferences are now different, and continue to change now as the years progress. So let's see what it is at about year 50, which is when the second generation of Humes become adults and move into the culture. The culture has been stable for a few years, and then it changes again. So at year 51 now, and we see ongoing diversity among the infants, children, and teenagers. And the culture hasn't been a traditional culture for the last 20 years. So let's keep running the graph for another generation, 25 years, to see what happens to the character of the culture. More changes to the culture. So ongoing diversity of the third generation of children, resulting in a changing character of the culture. Once the graph reaches the preset target year of 75, it reverts to the normal simulation display. So now at year 75, we have a neurochemically diverse population of about 1,000 Humes. It's not easy to see the diversity. But if we look at the political representatives of the population at this time, we see that they have a diverse range of first preferences. This is because each representative is chosen based on what are the prevalent neurochemical processes of the individuals in the area. So we have this range of first preferences among them, from sensory awareness, metaphysics, rationality, and self-awareness. This is what we would expect to happen when we set the simulation to a nature-only influence scenario. Let's run the simulation again now, with the influences of the culture acting on the population. We'll also keep the same setting of the inherited characteristics, but now add the influences of the caregivers, teachers, friends and peers, and the culture as a whole. So this is the more realistic scenario of a nature-nurture dynamic. Here we go. So cultural influences are acting. Once again, we see the diversity of the newborns. So here are the new counts, as the first generation move into the child and teenage years, while being influenced by the culture. There's some diversity amongst the children now, but the population is only relatively small. When we get to year 30, which was when the culture changed in the previous run, we see that the culture is maintained and continues to be maintained. Also we see that once the population increases, the two most prevalent neurochemical preferences of the child and teenage years starts to stabilize to other awareness and metaphysics. This indicates that the cultural influences acting on the children do indeed shape their first neurochemical preference to that of the culture as a whole. So as the simulation moves past year 50, we see the stable pattern of a traditional culture, which is being replenished by a new generation of culturally similar young humans. And this continues on when the third generation starts moving into the adult population. We see continued stability of the culture. So by the time we reach year 75, we see that we have essentially the same traditional culture that we started with. Once again, this is best seen by looking at the first neurochemical preferences of the political representatives from each area. We see only two preferences now: other awareness and metaphysics. So after 3 generations, the culture has been able to reproduce itself. Unlike the previous run, with just nature operating, which resulted in ongoing changes to the character of the culture from 30 years on. This is what we would expect to happen with this run, given the influences of the culture acting at every stage of childhood development. But the main intention here is to demonstrate that the simulation is working correctly in modeling the nature-nurture dynamic at this first attempt. And what's important about modeling the nature-nurture dynamic in this way is that it's now possible to control the influences on child development at each stage of the process. We can, for example, change the amount of influence teachers have on children during the school years and observe the outcomes, as we'll see in the next video. So this dynamic graph then will be an essential tool for this type of analysis. This now ends the video, and it also brings to an end part A of the simulation project, which has 3 stages. The objective of this first part was to create a simulation which can model a self-reproducing traditional culture. And as we have just seen, this has now been completed. In the next part of the project, part B, the objective will be to model cultural change. And in particular, the change from a traditional culture to a modern culture. So I hope you'll be back for that. Bye for now.